All right, without further ado, I want to invite up our keynote speakers. So we are going to be hearing from John Tepena and Madeline Barron from Echo Northwest. They have been the firm that has been working on our cost analysis for these last couple years, and they're going to share more information about what they found.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Brittany. So needless to say, with this many people showing up early on a Tuesday morning, this is a top community concern. And I was looking at some polling that DHM, sort of the longtime polling firm in Oregon, did a couple of weeks ago, and sort of asked open-ended question: what is the topic that you really feel the public needs to be working on, public elected leaders? And with as much division as we have in the state and this country, if you looked at the answers from Democrats, independents, and Republicans, they were all at sort of 42, 43, 44% saying homelessness was an issue that needed to be addressed in this state. So no sort of ideological divide around the nature of this problem. And clearly a major problem here. So that the core of what we're doing here that we were asked to do, as Brittany mentioned, is sort of an accounting exercise, which can seem boring, but we will persuade you over the course of this morning that it was a critical first step to understanding where are resources coming into this region to address this challenge, and what are they being spent on, and what we might anticipate in the future in terms of that kind of investment and spending. And without having done that, it's really hard for me to understand how this community could go forward, or how, for example, the governor or the legislature could think about investing more in this community going forward. So there we go. So I'm going to move through some high-level context on the challenge, and then I'm going to turn it over to Madeline to sort of talk about what we call the sources and uses exercise. Very first, we are from Echo Northwest. Echo Northwest was founded here in Eugene 50 years ago next week. I guess quick question, anybody here ever take an economics class from Ed Whitelaw? There we go, some Ed Whitelaw. So founded by Ed Whitelaw back in 1974. We're always thrilled to have the opportunity to work in this community, our founding community. So background, you're going to see multiple numbers. You've already seen two different numbers in this presentation from Brittany that conflicted with one another. They were just different points in time of the number of people who are homeless. And there are multiple ways to sort of calculate it. And we've got a bunch of competing measures right now. We've got the by name database. We've got the point in time count. We've got data that comes out of the homeless management information system, et cetera. And they, at this point, aren't really talking to each other as well as we would like them to. So I'm going to talk ever so briefly about some of the numbers that we've been looking at. The point in time count, again, that's a particular day in January. That is how HUD likes to calculate these numbers, and we report back to HUD in that way. And my clicker stopped working. Or let's see, does that? No. So something happened here. Is it possible for me to have somebody back there advance the slides? Okay, I'll just say advance slides. So if we could go back just a couple, and I'll step through these. So first of all, overall homelessness in that point in time count, which is taken in January, it was 1,600 roughly in 2018, almost 2,300 in 2023. Unsheltered homelessness, 75% of people were unsheltered. That means they were not in an emergency shelter or transitional housing in 2023. That's up 65% from 2020. Chronic homelessness, that's a HUD definition, homeless for more than a year or multiple times over the course of several years. 43% of chronically homeless folks were sheltered in 2023. That's up 24% from 2020. I'm just going to sort of cover this. If you go to the federal report on homelessness, that was just released for 2022, and you search on the word Eugene Springfield, you're going to see yourselves in there several times. There's a PDF, you can search on it. You're high for the size of this region. You have high rates of homelessness among families with children, and you have exceptionally high rates of unsheltered homelessness. Top for a sort of large a mid-sized urban region. So let's keep going. We'll go through here briskly. This again, we're going to throw a bunch of conflicting numbers at you, but these are the counts over time of people who have received services sometime over the course of the year. So as opposed to a point in time, which is a snapshot on a particular day, this is more like a documentary over the course of the year. How many different people were served over the course of the year who were homeless? And so you're going to have a bigger number, the difference between a snapshot and a documentary of the total number of people over the course of the year who experienced homelessness. And you can see we're sort of on the way there in 2023 up to this point. Next slide. In terms of conditions that folks have as they come in, the share with who are veterans, who have survived domestic violence, chronically homeless, or have some disabling condition, and or who are unsheltered for Lane County and Eugene, respectively. And again, that unsheltered number is especially high nationally relative to other places. The West Coast in particular, in Hawaii, very high rates of unsheltered homelessness relative to what you see on the East Coast. Keep going. And then we would like to sort of step back and talk about sort of a broader population. Who's at risk of being homeless? So you can think of people who are homeless at a point in time, but we would say there is a much broader population of people who have low incomes and are rent burdened and are just one crisis away. It could be domestic violence, it could be the loss of a job, it could be some other disruption to their life that will push them into homelessness. And so we always need to pay attention to this. So we've got 16,000 plus who are not enrolled in school. We broke that out here in this community because the University of Oregon and Lane Community College, et cetera, also have sort of sizable numbers of people who fall into that category of low income and rent burden. That's a slightly different problem, but you do have students who are struggling, and so it's not that we're supposed to ignore those. So some high level overviews here. We do not have a slide on race and ethnicity here, but we will say that in this region and nationally, disproportionate relative to their population, rates of homelessness for Black and African American and for Native Americans. And in some places, we'd have to check here for Hispanic families as well. So we'll keep moving. Now, sort of framing the issue, what are the root causes of homelessness? I'm going to do a flash poll right here. A forced question. Primary driver is housing market conditions, or is it the personal circumstances of those who are experiencing homelessness? So that's A and B, and obviously there's an interaction between those, but if you're thinking about the primary reason that this community has a high incidence of homelessness, would you bet on the housing market? Would you bet on the personal circumstances of those who are experiencing? So all for housing. All who would say personal circumstances. All right, that's pretty common in a poll. It's split, and what I would say here is that we've got to get some understanding, because depending on which one of those is actually true, you're going to have different kinds of policy interventions. So we have to think about that. Now I'm going to step through, and I will say, obviously, both of them play into who is homeless and the interventions that you're going to have. But in terms of market, think of this as sort of a systemic, wide, metro-wide issue. You've got inadequate supply of housing, underproduction of housing, and rents rising faster than incomes. And on behavioral factors influencing homelessness, we'll show you some data there. Obviously, those with substance abuse disorder, comorbidity, or chronic illness, mental health conditions, et cetera, are experiencing homelessness at much higher rates than those who don't have those conditions. So let's unpack that a little bit. In terms of some studies, we're an economics consulting firm, so we turn to the economics for our answers, and our answers are going to say, what makes this region different is its housing market. And so I'm going to step through that, and that's not like I'm calling out on all the people who answered with the personal circumstances, because it is a complex issue. But let me sort of step through some of this math. A study back in 2001 showed a 10% increase predicted of rent, 13% increase in a region's rate of homelessness. 2001, 10% increase in housing vacancy, a 3% decline in the rate of homelessness. So if vacancy goes up, homelessness goes down. In 2022, I think this is a GAO, said a $100 increase in rent leads to a 9% increase in the region's rate of homelessness. Let's go to the next slide. Madeline and I did this piece of work back in 2018, looking at metro areas and the rate of homelessness. And basically found that if you looked at median gross rent and then compared it to the incidence of homelessness by metro area, you got this very strong correlation between these. In terms of a statistical, or a statistic here, you would say that about 57% of the variation in homelessness across these metro areas was explained by the difference in rent. And so now how do we square this circle between what we see on the street in terms of all the struggles with substance abuse, with behavioral health, et cetera, and this housing story? I think the best single quote I've ever heard was from a UCLA professor who said that homelessness is the highest where difficult personal circumstances intersect with a tough housing market. And if you're still not persuaded, I would say go look at the rates of homelessness in Arkansas and West Virginia. They've got plenty of issues with disability, opioid rates, and all that kind of thing. They do not have especially high rates of homelessness. Where you see high rates of homelessness in this country are in the west coast of the United States and between New York and Boston on the east coast and up into New England. So housing market factors, I'm going to blazing feet. I'm just going to tell you your housing market is a mess. It's too expensive. It's too expensive. So here's annual housing unit permits in Eugene. Let's keep going. There's some data over here on the right. We're about to come out with a study, Madeline, in the next few days, a national study. We're pegging your metropolitan area at a deficit of 6,600 housing units. That's your legacy deficit. It's just, you have too many households living here for the number of housing units that you have. It's way too tight. And that's part of what the governor's been working on and trying to push, this housing production strategy. We have done a lot of consulting on that and would say that if you want to get out of this crisis, that is your long-term game. That is your 5 to 15-year solution to this. If you don't make progress on this housing supply relative to the number of people who are living here, you will spend all kinds of money and you will not make the kind of progress that you need to be making on the homelessness front. So we'll keep going. Here's your affordable housing development. You had a good 2022. We would like to see going forward more like that than the previous years. But the point being, as Madeline's report's going to show out, is not only do you have underproduction and you're going to have to build for more people coming into the future, but you're going to have to pay attention across the income spectrum. The market doesn't go out and doesn't build affordable housing very much. That's going to take probably some public subsidy and/or build it for the market and give people vouchers. Keep your mic close. Oh, keep the mic close. Okay, thank you. All right, there's your housing prices. Those are too high. They've been going up. That's bad. That just causes more problems. So we'll keep going. Your rents are up. You already saw. I already showed on the previous thing. If your rents go up, you're going to have more homelessness. Keep going. And here's cost burdening, especially bad for low-income renters. So this is below 30% of the area median income. If a household is in that space, 80% plus of them are spending more than 30% of their income on rent. In that 30 to 60% AMI space, 83%. I mean, those are probably statistically the same number, but just impossible budgets to be dealing with. Once you get into that cost burden space, you are attempting to balance budgets that are brutal, and many of them probably severely cost burden, spending more than 50% of their income on rent. So we'll keep going, and then I will say, and again, I didn't mean to sort of create this sort of split between the room in terms of behavioral factors and housing factors, because behavioral factors are playing into this, and they have to be paid attention to, and they have to be addressed, especially when people find themselves in this condition. Good folks in Silicon Valley did one of the better studies that I've seen on this on the next slide, that basically went through, and this is going to be something that will be helpful in your by name database, is once you start to understand people's histories, they are very predictive of how long people are going to, who are going to be people that would otherwise cost themselves and the community $100,000 over the course of the next year, versus those who may only cost the community and themselves $5,000 to $10,000 over the course of the next year. You're going to have to do a lot of tough cost-benefit analysis and segmentation of your homeless population, given that you have, Madeline's about to tell you, limited resources that in the short term appear to be going down. You're going to have to think very strategically and tactically about how you're going to use those limited resources. And basically, this out of Silicon Valley sort of showed, those with criminal justice histories, with behavioral health, and lots of interactions with the health system, et cetera. It will give you a sense of what their likely outcomes are going to be if you don't intervene. And so both issues very important, and both have to be taken into consideration in a intervention response. And I think, if we go to the next slide, now we're going to turn over to this accounting exercise that may seem a little boring for a Tuesday morning, but I think is absolutely critical as your response goes forward.
All right, thank you, John. So we can go ahead to the next slide. As Brittany mentioned, one of the major goals of this research and of the summit was to shed light on and expand understanding of the issue. So John just stepped through a number of statistics and research that demonstrates that while controlling for unemployment rates and poverty rates and rates of disability recipients or SNAP benefits in a community, housing market factors really are the driving influence for homelessness. But in search of solutions, the Chamber asked us some of these primary research questions around how much money is being spent in the community. Where is that money coming from? Where is that money going towards? What are the biggest components of your homelessness system? And looking at a couple of years of data, particularly in the past couple of years with the COVID pandemic and federal funds and increased interventions, and as Brittany mentioned, different resource capacities at shelters and at other parts of the systems. What conclusions can we draw from this data and from the analysis of what you guys are spending? And I'll just preface by saying this is an incredibly complicated question to answer. Very, very few communities, this may be the first in the state of Oregon, have attempted to answer this question and have actually released the information. So big kudos to the community for taking this on. It is complicated. There's some charts, there's some data. We worked with several of the data providers, as Brittany mentioned. You can go to the next slide. We talked with Lane County, we talked with City of Eugene, City of Springfield, Homes for Good, and many other experts and community members to try to get a handle on what spending is happening in the community over the FY22 and FY23 fiscal years. So as I said, this was during the pandemic. There was a lot of COVID spending happening. We asked the data providers to categorize things. We said, what's one time? What are your sources? What are your uses? Categorize it. You can see in the charts on your table and in the descriptions on the second page, what are the programs that are being served? How do they operate? How do we understand it? There's 4 different data providers, so we needed to have people talking to one another and streamlining things, and that's not typical. So this is a really challenging exercise, but we think we've arrived at some good analysis and good data for you. Some context here is that most homeless spending is federal, most of it, and then federal and then from the state. These are really big issues. These are really big dollars that we're about to talk through, and it's far too big for any local community to take on. most of it is kind of functional. It flows through communities through formulas based on per capita, based on need, based on poverty rates. So a lot of communities don't, you don't have a lot of discretion over the big dollars on where it's spent and how it's spent. There's some programs like the home funding or CDBG from the federal government, from HUD, that you have a little bit of discretion, but there's still a lot of regulations on how that money is spent. That said, COVID-era emergency programs did increase the money flowing into the community dramatically, and also were more discretionary than typical. But the most important piece on this slide is the very last bullet, and the fact of the matter is that these massive increases in spending are time limited. They are going to go away. They are already starting to decline. So if you go to the next slide. This is also in your handout. You can see, just as I'm talking through kind of some of these categories, here's what we categorize things as. There's admin and unallocated spending. I want to highlight that we asked for expenditures, not budgets. So we are looking at real dollars that went out and into the community. Encampments, shelters, emergency shelters, and safe parking programs, kind of just some of that safety off the streets. We looked at just generic outreach and case management, and prevention. Prevention is huge and extremely important in this space. Permanent supportive housing, that's a specific type of housing that includes wraparound services and mental health services, behavioral health services, job placement sometimes, medical, dental, and just generic case management supports. Rapid rehousing, that's sort of a time-limited program of getting you into housing and giving you rent assistance, but that tapers off over time. And then services, basic services like 211 and domestic violence services, legal fees, or not fees, legal services and tenant protections. And then transitional housing, which is, as it sounds, short-term housing that gets people into housing, and then working with case managers to get into more permanent solutions. Thank you. Importantly, so that was what was included, and it's also important to think about what was excluded. This is a slippery slope. It's a hard exercise to do, but we had to draw boundaries on what we considered to be homeless spending. So we excluded regular vouchers from the federal government that flow through housing authorities, and unless it was specifically targeted for people experiencing or at risk or exiting homelessness, the amount of just generic Section 8 housing choice vouchers coming from HUD would dwarf, would pretty much double or triple the spending that we're talking about that's specifically on homelessness. And that's a very important program. It goes towards some of that prevention that we're talking about and some of those at-risk communities, that 16,000 people who were low-income renters who were spending too much on rent. Many of those people might have vouchers or could benefit from a voucher, but we didn't include it for the purposes of the data we're about to step through. We also didn't include capital expenditures to build new units, new regulated affordable housing or permanent supportive housing. This is challenging to look at in and of itself, but really it was just we had to draw the line, and we're looking at operating dollars on services and on case management and systems. We also had to draw the line at kind of like workforce is typically 80% of the area median income. That would be the area median income in Lane County is about $90,000 at the median, and that's for a family of 4. So 80% of that and above, it's not really imminent risk of homelessness. And then you can see here general fair housing spending, and then indirect spending from the police, fire, parks, library, et cetera, unless it was specifically included by the data providers as being targeted towards homelessness. We didn't include it. It's a really big number if you can calculate it to estimate kind of the all other spending to serve and react to homelessness. So next slide. Lastly, because we're looking at the FY22 and 23 years, what is one time? We identified all the coronavirus-specific emergency spending that went into the community. We also looked at some FEMA money that I think was both on the pandemic and recovery. We looked at the wildfire response funding that had come in a couple years ago. The Lane County has an emergency rent assistance program they stood up with ARPA and other federal dollars. General funds, we worked with the data providers to say, is this kind of a stable general fund that you fund every year, or is this more of an ad hoc discretionary one-time grant, and if it was one time, we excluded it. We didn't get a huge handle on private donations because there's a lot of individual spending that's really not categorized and doesn't come from the public sector data providers. So the private information we did have, we called one time because it's not reliable, it's not ongoing, and then just there's other specific programs. So next slide, here's the big reveal. In fiscal year 2022, we calculated that the region was spending about $55 million on homelessness in that year. In FY23, it was $47 million. So that's a 16% decrease year over year. And the next slide, when we broke out those one-time things, all of the coronavirus spending, all of the state emergency rental assistance, when we looked at general funds, et cetera, we saw that that accounted for about $44 million of the 55. So 80% of the FY22 spending we were categorizing and we agreed with the data providers was considered one time. It's about 70% of that FY23 number was one time. And you can also see that that's a big decrease. That's a 25% decrease from fiscal year 22 to 23. Next slide is the residual. So what's left? The ongoing spending that we agreed with the data providers was, what you could kind of call your baseline, excluding as if the pandemic had never happened, what your systems are spending. So $11 million in FY22 and $14 million in FY23. So that's actually really nice. That's a 12% increase and something that you should all be extremely hopeful about. But it's also worth noting, that's only 20% of the 55 million. So a fraction of what you guys have seen in the past 2-3 years, only a fraction of that is going to remain without other sustained bigger investments from the state, of course, from the feds. This issue is too big for local communities to take on themselves. But of course, kudos, every effort matters. This chart is on your table. So there's a lot to unpack here. This is showing by source. So where did the money originate? Federal, state, county, from the city of Springfield and Eugene, and the private dollars. It's showing fiscal year 2022 on the bottom, so the teal colors, and fiscal year 2023 on the top, the blue colors. And then further complicating the chart is that the darker bars are the one-time spending and the lighter bars are the ongoing spending. So a couple of things you can see here is that big decline in federal dollars from fiscal year 2022, the teal bar, to fiscal year 2023, the blue bar. You can also see that the majority of both of those years' spending was one time. It's exciting to see that the increase from the fiscal year 2022, the teal to the blue, and also, very exciting to see that the ongoing, those lighter color bars went up between fiscal year 2022 on the bottom and fiscal year 2023 on the top. You can see county, there was a slight decline, and we have it as all ongoing. The way we categorized this information was the county basically passed through. They did receive one-time funding, but it didn't originate with the county. So the way we've categorized it is that probably some of the federal and state dollars flows through the county, but it goes to the cities or the nonprofits. And it's probably not zero, but it's a rounding error there, and it doesn't show up on the chart. We can also see the city of Eugene, a slight increase. We also know that the city of Eugene passed a tax that is going to be serving this industry, and I think the understanding is that just doesn't really show up in the data in these years just yet, so that's kind of a positive thing. And you can see, private donations in the city of Springfield, smaller numbers there and relatively more stable year over year. So next slide. This is also in your table. It's a breakdown of spending in the same exact way, except by the use category. So again, you can see that massive increase in one-time spending, almost $30 million, probably mostly from the feds and the state, of prevention dollars that went to those emergency rent assistance programs that kept people housed, kept people in their homes. It was also at the time where there were no there was no evictions allowed. So that was extremely important during the pandemic. People were not being evicted, and they were they were to the extent possible receiving rent assistance to stay in their homes. You can see roughly stable year-over-year spending on emergency shelters and safe parking. Again, the majority of that coming from those one-time sources. And then I'd like to highlight the big increase in admin and kind of system spending, and that increase is primarily driven by ongoing investments. So we heard directly that the cities and the counties have made big long-term investments in the systems. This is a crisis. They recognize it. They are spending to shore up their data collection, the by name list, and the reporting features, and case management, and all of that takes administration and systems and investments. You all have you can see the chart on your table and kind of look through it a little bit more, some of these, the changes over time, and then the breakdown of ongoing versus one-time spending. So I'll move on to the next slide. That was a lot of boring accounting system, but accounting functions, but we wanted to also, so if we were gonna consider what would it take? That's the hardest question to answer. And there's no one solution. As we all saw, that there's a big difference in, there's a difference in opinion of what is the driver of homelessness, but there's also that indicates that there's a difference in the solutions, and it's mostly a both and. You need everything. There's a lot, and I'm sure other people today are gonna talk about the fact that behavioral health issues can start after someone is already experiencing homelessness, or it can be a factor that leads into homelessness. It's a both and. Still, if there's a gap analysis, what would it take? What would it take to house everyone? So this is an extremely theoretical exercise, and we are primarily looking at operating costs. So putting aside, inflows and outflows of homelessness and how actually impactful each intervention might be, putting aside the administrative costs that you would need if you gave everyone a voucher and everyone a permanent supportive housing unit, and those systems needed to function. Put aside the fact that you need market vacancy. If you give everyone who needs one a voucher, the market can't necessarily absorb that. There aren't exactly enough units just sitting there waiting for additional vouchers to be filled. And put aside, what would happen to your housing market if you dropped in millions of dollars of government subsidy into the rental market. That would cause changes in your rental market. And then also, this is a big one, put aside what it would cost to develop new permanent supportive housing units. So that's not in this. I have underlined the fact that this is gonna snapshot look at operating costs. But this can be a simple exercise, some simple math. If you can go to the next slide. Take the number of people, what they would get as an intervention, how many interventions you need, and what that might cost each intervention. And this is some of those statistics. So this is a kind of a framework that we're borrowing from the Corporation for Supportive Housing. They've done research. They are a research organization advocating for more permanent supportive housing and the benefits of that type of intervention. They suggest that about 90% of those experiencing chronic homelessness need a permanent supportive housing unit, and then 10% need just rent assistance. They just need cheaper places to live without the services. With the population experiencing episodic or transitional homelessness, it's reversed. Maybe 10% of that population actually needs a permanent supportive housing unit with those wraparound services, and the rest just need cheaper rent. The numbers at the top are the average monthly HMIS users, so that number is pretty, and for fiscal year 2023 year to date, excluding July, because you saw on the chart Brittany presented that there's a big drop off when kind of the systems reset. We asked the Homes for Good, the local housing authority here, kind of what are some of the costs that it would take to operate a permanent supportive housing unit. So that's both the rent subsidy and all of the services, case management, job placement, mental health, all the services that are included in that unit. It's about $30,000 per unit per year. And for those who just need cheaper rent, just need a voucher, what does that cost? It's about $8,100 of public subsidy per year. And then the bottom, we did some math to go from 4,400 individuals down through the interventions and different average household sizes. So we're looking at households here on the bottom, different household sizes based on the chronic or the episodic population and whether there's children in the area. And so you'd need about 1,600 PSH units, and you'd need about 1,200 vouchers. Okay, so here's the big number. When you do that math, you get to an annual cost of about $59 million of just operations. So if you thought like $30,000 per unit of permanent supportive housing, and you need 1,600 of those, that's how we get to some of this. You have $1,200 well, you have $8,000 of vouchers, and you need 1,200 of those. Do the math based on those interventions. So this is the operating costs that would theoretically serve those people. Again, putting aside market vacancy, putting aside the cost to develop the permanent supportive housing units, you're looking at $60 million a year of operating costs. And I'll remind you that the ongoing dollars on slides prior was about $11 million, $14 million per year in your system. And that's all the prevention, all of the services, all the outreach, all the encampments, all the shelters. So this is a really big number. And I'll go to the next slide. We won't leave you hanging here, conclusions, policy takeaways. So what do you do about it? So this is the harder question in the conversation, but there's really three big ways you can intervene in homelessness. This convening is a great example of getting started and sharing understanding and bringing people to the table. You know, you can reduce your inflows into homelessness. That's prevention, that's outreach, that's legal services, that's eviction prevention, that's fair housing issues so people aren't facing discrimination. That's rent assistance, that's vouchers. There's a lot that can be done here. The need is great. You can also increase, you can also increase your outflows. So speed up the housing placement, get people into PSH units where they're available, keep people in those units. That is very challenging. This is also about preserving your regulated affordable housing. John shared a slide earlier that you're building about you've built 1,800 in the past several years. That's not enough. That's not much. That's not fast enough. And so increasing outflows. And then keeping people housed, making sure that they have those services, making sure that their case managers it's a good match, it's a good relationship, and that it's successful. And then, the other thing is while you're building units, while you're getting your housing market to whipped into shape, while you're creating policies and other interventions, while you're expanding your systems, you can also make the experience of homelessness just easier and more humane and more comfortable in the meantime. Go to the next slide. So we like this chart. It shows sort of it's an inverted pyramid looking at your probability of becoming homeless. At the top, it's the lowest. So this is like the largest population at the top, the biggest intervention, your whole housing market. Just market rate housing is big. There's more people in that. The next is workforce housing and, regulated affordable housing for those middle income or 60% of AMI areas. Orange would be more target interventions and prevention and systems and services vouchers. And then your red is emergency shelters and encampments and safe parking. So the triangle narrows as it goes down because there's fewer and fewer and fewer people at the bottom of the pyramid, but the acuity is much higher. The actual intensity of the services, the cost of the services is higher down there. And the gist is that without upstream interventions in your higher housing market, reducing the rate that rent is increasing, reducing the rate that home prices are increasing, all your other interventions are going to be more expensive and less effective than if you weren't to solve your upstream solutions. And so, some of the ideas that Brittany is talking about that, stay hopeful. I think that the increases in ongoing spending, the investments that the community has made in the systems and in the administration and the services, a lot of that was just to get those federal dollars out the door and to do it successfully and to get in touch with people, that's a cause for hope. There has been a lot of attention and understanding and compassion on this issue locally, and a lot of attention and policy changes at the state level as well. So Governor Kotek, this is one of her major priorities. There's also big changes coming in the kind of writ large up in the green, the housing market. The housing market just spurring the community to build more housing writ large. Yes, you need more housing because you have people coming here, you have high demand for housing, you have low vacancy, you need more housing in general, and then you also need more housing that's regulated and affordable and safe and adequate, and the rent's not going to change. So there's a lot of, and then I think Brittany's roadmap, you're going to hear a lot of positivity and a lot of interventions and new highlights for the systems today. And so those are your good policy solutions. I will leave it there and let the rest of the program today speak for itself. Thank you.